Bjorn Eriksson's hands, raw and splintered from wood, were riddled with blackened, infected wounds. Yet, he dared not stop working, for starvation loomed over his family until the harsh winter finally ended. His fingers were so swollen he could barely clench them, and every tool he touched left treacherous trails of pus and blood on its handle. It was March of 987 in the land that would one day become Norway, and Bjorn hadn't tasted meat in 4 long months. His ribs protruded sharply through his thinning skin, like the posts of a decrepit fence. His teeth wobbled and fell out from the relentless scurvy, and his 8-year-old daughter seemed to have stopped growing, a stark consequence of the catastrophic food shortage. This was a far cry from the romanticized image of a Viking warrior, axe in hand, carving through waves on a longship. This was the grim reality faced by 90% of Viking society, farmers so destitute that even medieval peasants would have seemed wealthy in comparison. His entire farm, a meager patch of land, was smaller than a modern parking lot, wrested from the frozen soil that daily engaged him in an unyielding battle. When images of Vikings come to mind, they often depict fearless warriors raiding England or enterprising traders bringing precious silver from distant Constantinople. But for every Viking warrior who ever held a sword, there were 24 farmers like Bjorn, whose lives were confined to a mere 10 miles from their birthplace. They lived in such a harsh and unforgiving world that reaching the age of 30 was considered a monumental victory over relentless fate. However, the true horror was that Bjorn was, in essence, fortunate compared to most Viking farmers. He owned his own land, albeit barely enough to feed his family for half the year. The majority of Viking farmers were tenants, forced to surrender half of their meager harvest to the local chieftain, leaving them with so little food that they spent 6 months of every year slowly, agonizingly starving. This period they called the hunger gap, the months between when the previous year's grain ran out and the new harvest arrived. During this hunger gap, families desperately tried to survive by eating tree bark soup, leather boiled until soft enough to chew, and anything else that wouldn't result in immediate death. Bjorn woke before dawn, in pitch darkness, for candles were an unaffordable luxury, and firewood too precious to waste on illumination. Inside his dwelling, it was 40 degrees colder than outside, as the walls were constructed of crude stones held together only by mud. A crust of ice had formed on the bucket of water beside his bed. His wife, Astrid, slept clad in all her clothes, including 2 pairs of wool socks she had knitted from wool they couldn't afford to sell. Their 3 children slept huddled together in a cramped bed, like stray puppies trying to conserve warmth. First thing every morning, Bjorn had to break the ice on the water barrel with a stone, as they didn't even possess a simple metal hammer. The water was murky and tasted of earth, as it came from a well he had dug himself using only wooden tools and brute strength. It had taken him 3 full months to dig this well, working 2 hours each morning before starting his farming duties. And even then, the water remained contaminated by runoff from the livestock pen, but it was the only water they had. So the entire family drank it, regularly suffering from illnesses that would be easily treatable today. Bjorn faced an agonizing choice: feed his family or feed the cow. Each time, he chose his family. The cow's milk became watery and thin, barely providing enough sustenance to keep his youngest child from dying of malnourishment. But without this cow, the entire family would be doomed to starvation. So Bjorn spent long hours each day gathering twigs, moss, and anything else the animal could digest. He fed the cow sawdust mixed with the last handful of grain, knowing it would eventually kill the animal, but hoping it would last long enough to survive this harsh winter. His field was a rocky plot of land he had cleared by hand, moving enormous stones for 2 long years until his back was permanently bent and his hands disfigured beyond recognition. The soil was so depleted that crops barely grew. And each year he harvested less grain than he had planted because the land grew worse and worse. He couldn't afford to let the field rest or add any fertilizer. So each season he exhausted the soil even further. The math was simple and horrifying. Each year, his farm produced less and less food, while his family required the same amount to survive. One of the metal parts of the plow had broken 3 seasons ago, and Bjorn had replaced it with a sharpened stick that barely scratched the frozen ground. Plowing his tiny field took 6 days of grueling work, after which he could barely walk. By the end of those days, his hands bled so profusely that he had to wrap them in strips torn from his only spare shirt. The plow was pulled by a dying cow, which meant that if the cow perished, Bjorn would have to pull the plow himself or condemn his family to starvation. Bjorn and his loved ones teetered on the brink of survival, exhausted by unyielding hunger. Their meager diet consisted of barley gruel, the rare milk from their emaciated cow, and wild herbs Astrid gathered with extreme caution to avoid poisoning. Fresh meat hadn't graced their table in half a year, as slaughtering livestock was an unaffordable luxury, and hunting remained out of reach due to the lack of weapons and equipment whose cost exceeded the value of their entire farm. Neighbors, who occasionally caught fish or game, offered them in exchange for grain at exorbitant prices, beyond Bjorn's means. His 8-year-old daughter, Sigrid, had long learned not to ask for more, and 5-year-old Olaf had given up active play due to exhaustion. The 1-year-old infant cried incessantly because Astrid, suffering from malnutrition, couldn't provide him with milk. Even in their dreams, they were haunted by images of bread, meat, and fresh milk, unattainable in reality. The family was slowly wasting away from hunger. Each day seemed ordinary, but each month brought them closer to inevitable demise. Bjorn's hut was a miserable sight. Wind freely whistled through cracks in the stone walls, and the earthen floor turned into a muddy mess when the snow melted. The hearth, built of rough stones, was the only source of heat, but scarce firewood supplies allowed them to light a fire only during the most bitter frosts, when the absence of warmth threatened imminent death. On most nights, the flames died long before midnight, and the family awoke to the icy breath of winter. Their clothes, meant to protect them from the cold, were worn and torn, and there were no funds to acquire new fabric or raise sheep. Bjorn had worn the same wool tunic for 3 years, patched with countless scraps, turning it into something resembling a brown blanket. His trousers were held up by a rope threaded through holes in the fabric, and instead of shoes, he used pieces of leather wrapped around his feet and tied with rags, as real boots cost a fortune. When the leather wore out, he walked barefoot on the frozen ground until frostbite forced Astrid to wrap his feet in moss to prevent infection. The labor that consumed Bjorn's life was grueling and endless, for Viking farming required unceasing care to avoid complete ruin. Every fence needed daily repair to protect crops from wild animals. Every tool required sharpening, as dull implements turned already difficult work into unbearable torture. The roof leaked in many places, which Bjorn patched with mud, grass, and stones, knowing these repairs wouldn't last long. He spent entire days searching for firewood, traveling vast distances to find dry branches, as all nearby forests had long been cleared. Besides the dying cow, they had 3 chickens, too weak to lay eggs, and a skinny pig that resembled a skeleton draped in skin. The animals huddled in the same dwelling as the family due to the lack of a barn, and the combined body heat was vital for survival. The air was thick with a suffocating stench of animal waste, unwashed bodies, rotting food, and hearth smoke. But this stench was the least of their problems, as the animals competed with the family for scarce food supplies. The isolation in Bjorn's life was almost absolute, as Viking farmers rarely left their lands during the winter months. The nearest neighbor lived 2 miles away, across frozen land where a snowstorm could become a deadly trap for travelers. Bjorn hadn't spoken to anyone outside his family for 4 months and wouldn't see other people until spring, when farmers gathered for communal work and tool sharing. This detachment from the world meant that in case of misfortunes, injuries, illnesses, or natural disasters, families were forced to cope alone or perish. Bjorn's eldest son had died 2 winters ago from a fever that lasted 3 days and drained his strength. Astrid suffered from a persistent cough with blood, likely due to constant smoke inhalation in their poorly ventilated hut. Sigrid had non-healing sores on her hands, and Olaf's teeth were rotting from malnutrition. The entire family's immune system was compromised by constant hunger and cold. They treated illnesses with herbal concoctions and prayers as they had no other means. The social order that kept families like Bjorn's in poverty was designed to maintain peasant destitution while enriching the warrior elite who made history. Bjorn was forced to pay taxes to the local chieftain, Olaf Haraldsson, despite barely being able to feed his children. These taxes were levied in grain, meaning Bjorn had to surrender food essential for his family's survival. Even in lean years, he had to pay the same amount, which presented him with a choice: pay taxes or watch his children starve. The system was intentionally cruel and merciless. Refusing to pay taxes threatened the loss of land and becoming a thrall, which was virtually a death sentence. If a wealthy neighbor's livestock destroyed Bjorn's crops, he had no legal recourse, as he couldn't afford to bring a claim before the local assembly. If someone stole his tools or cheated him in trade, Bjorn had to accept the loss, as resistance would lead to conflict with someone who had more resources and connections. The law protected property, but only for those who had enough of it to matter. Bjorn's arduous peasant labor was defined by primitive agricultural methods, dictated by the lack of funds for advanced tools and technologies. Sowing seeds was done by hand. He methodically walked his plot, dropping grains into holes pre-made with a sharpened stick. Harvesting was also a difficult task. Stalks were cut with a crude sickle, a blade attached to a short handle. Then followed the threshing process, where grain was beaten from the stalks with sticks. This laborious process took weeks of exhausting work, with a significant portion of the harvest lost to birds, unfavorable weather conditions, and the general inefficiency of the methods used. The introduction of modern agricultural techniques could have tripled the harvest yield, but this required metal tools, draft animals, and knowledge unavailable to Bjorn. Spring meant the start of planting, when he spent 18 hours a day on the land, trying to prepare soil that stubbornly resisted any attempts to make it fertile. Summer demanded unceasing vigilance against pests, weeds, and the vagaries of weather, which could, in an instant, negate months of labor. Autumn brought the busy harvest season, when the entire family worked tirelessly to gather every single grain that could stave off hunger. Winter, however, transformed into a harsh test of survival, when everything that could provide warmth and sustenance was used, from furniture for kindling to anything edible that wasn't dangerous to consume. The prospects for Bjorn's children were even bleaker than his own fate, as the farm yielded less each year. Upon Bjorn's death, his modest landholding would be divided among his sons, leading to an even greater reduction in arable land for each of them. His daughter, most likely, would marry an equally poor farmer, sharing with him the desperate struggle for survival. None of the children were destined to learn to read, leave their native area, or find opportunities unavailable to their father. They were condemned to languish in a closed loop of poverty that would continue until the land finally ceased to yield any harvest at all. Climatic conditions during Bjorn's era corresponded to a period historians would later call the medieval warm period. However, for struggling peasants like him, even minor weather fluctuations could be the fatal line between life and death. A dry summer portended crop failure and famine. A prolonged winter meant food supplies would be exhausted even before spring planting began. A single hailstorm could destroy the fruits of months of labor and condemn a family to agonizing starvation. Bjorn possessed neither the ability to predict the weather nor the resources to prepare for natural disasters. Therefore, his family constantly teetered on the brink of catastrophe. His broken plow was worth more than his dwelling. His dull knife was his most valuable possession, as replacing it would cost more than the entire family earned in half a year. He had virtually no metal, except for a small blade, a few bent nails, and a piece of rusted wire used to repair broken tools. Everything else was made from wood, stone, leather, and rope, which he obtained and processed himself, using methods passed down through generations of similarly dispossessed peasants. Sigrid learned to spin wool, weave cloth, cook food from any available ingredients, and identify edible plants. Olaf learned skills in tool repair, animal care, planting and harvesting, and building shelters capable of withstanding winter weather. None of the children were taught reading, writing, or arithmetic, beyond the basic calculations necessary for farm management. Their education was exclusively practical, as theoretical knowledge was an unaffordable luxury for their family. The religious beliefs that sustained Bjorn's family were a curious blend of Old Norse paganism and new Christian influences, reflecting the shifting religious landscape of 10th century Scandinavia. Bjorn continued to make offerings to the Norse gods who commanded weather and harvest. At the same time, he attended Christian services when traveling priests visited their area. His prayers were simple and full of despair. Pleas for enough food to survive the winter, for the health of his livestock, for an abundant harvest despite the meager soil. He appealed to all the gods he had ever heard of, as his family needed every possible help. The entertainment that brightened Bjorn's monotonous days consisted of stories, which they used to pass the longest winter nights when any work became impossible. Astrid knew many ancient tales of heroes, gods, and monsters, with which she entertained the children, trying to distract them from their hunger. These stories served as their only connection to the rich Viking culture, full of discovery and adventure. However, for a family that had never left the vicinity of their farm, these tales seemed as distant as fairy tales. The heroes of the stories possessed weapons, ships, and treasures, things so alien to Bjorn's experience that they might as well have been magic. The medical knowledge that sustained Bjorn's family was a kaleidoscope of folk remedies, passed down orally through generations lacking access to qualified healers. Astrid could accurately identify plants capable of quelling fever, stopping bleeding, or, if incorrectly prepared, leading to death. She knew how to apply wooden splints for fractures, stitch wounds with animal sinews, and treat burns with mud and moss. However, her knowledge was limited to those injuries and illnesses that a person could manage without professional help. Serious ailments sounded like a death sentence. Death, like an unyielding shadow, constantly hung over Bjorn's family, becoming so commonplace that the children learned to perceive it as an inherent part of life. Bjorn's parents died barely past their 40th year, struck down by diseases that are easily treatable in the modern world. His brother froze to death in a harsh winter when their humble dwelling collapsed under the weight of snow. 3 of his children died before reaching the age of 5. The survivors understood that death could strike at any moment from hunger, cold, sickness, or accident. They feared not so much death itself, but the suffering that preceded it. The grain he grew went to merchants who transported it to cities and sold it at prices beyond Bjorn's comprehension. The wool from local sheep was turned into fabric by artisans who asked more for a single shirt than Bjorn earned in a whole month. The hides of cattle were used to make shoes, belts, and armor that poor farmers could not afford. Bjorn created wealth that enriched everyone who came into contact with it, except for himself. The hope that drove Bjorn, despite his unbearable circumstances, was entirely focused on his children being able to live a slightly better life than he did. He dreamed that Olaf would inherit enough land to feed his family, that Sigrid would marry a farmer with more fertile soil, and that the infant would live to adulthood in a world full of opportunities. These were modest hopes, far from dreams of wealth or adventure, but simple desires for survival and basic security. But even these modest hopes seemed increasingly illusory as the farm continued to decline and the family weakened with each passing year. The harsh reality of Viking farmer life was that most families like Bjorn's did not last more than 2 or 3 generations before losing their land and disappearing from the annals of history. The farms that prospered were those that boasted better soil, greater resources, or access to trade routes that brought additional income. Poor farmers were gradually squeezed out by economic pressures over which they had no control. Forced to sell their land to pay taxes or debts, they became thralls or beggars, stripped of any protection. The Viking Age, celebrated by historians, was built on the backs of farmers whose stories were never recorded, as their lives were deemed too ordinary to be remembered. The legacy left by individuals like Bjorn remained unseen, as poor Viking farmers etched their names into history through suffering, not through achievements. They fed the warriors who raided England, grew the grain that supplied trade expeditions, and raised the children who became the next generation of Vikings. Yet their personal histories vanished into oblivion as they could not afford runestones, owned no valuable burial goods, and left no written records. They lived, struggled, and died in obscurity, supporting a civilization that remembered them only as statistics. When Bjorn Eriksson died at the age of 34, his body was worn out by decades of relentless toil. His family lost their farm within 2 years, as his children were too young to effectively work the land. Astrid remarried a widower with slightly better land, and Bjorn's children grew up as stepchildren, disinherited and without prospects beyond the same grueling poverty their father endured. His unmarked grave was denoted by a cairn of stones, which eventually dispersed, leaving no lasting testament to his existence. He was buried in his only clothes, clutching a broken knife, his most prized possession. Such was the harsh reality for the vast majority of Vikings, not the valiant warriors and wealthy merchants who dominate popular imagination, but desperate farmers clinging to life in a brutal world that offered them no security, no comfort, and no hope for betterment. They were the invisible foundation of Viking society, and their suffering made possible everything we remember about the Viking Age. Their stories deserve to be told,